Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to join in and settle in. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who just joined, we're just giving everyone a couple of minutes to settle in. Okay, I think the participant numbers have stabilized. We can start with the webinar. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Implementation Strategies for CLI-ECA. My name is Rishabh Sharma, and I work as the Technical Services Coordinator at MEA. Before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping notes. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and posted on the MEA's website. Also, that the chat function has been disabled for this session. We request all participants to use the Q&A function to ask the questions. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Now, I'll just quickly introduce our presenters from Ainley Group. We have Vardhini and Michael today. Vardhini brings over 13 years of experience delivering municipal water and wastewater infrastructure projects across Ontario. She specializes in hydraulic modeling, infrastructure planning, and environmental assessments. With advanced expertise in InfoWorks ICM and related modeling platforms, she supports municipalities in optimizing performance and advancing compliance readiness under Ontario's CLI-ECA framework. And we have Michael Mooney. Michael has over 22 years of experience leading complex municipal infrastructures across Canada and the US, including large-scale capital portfolios. His expertise spans across municipal class EAs, master servicing plans, water and wastewater systems, and major linear infrastructure. He supports municipalities in strengthening governance, documentation, and operational readiness, including implementation strategies under Ontario's CLI-ECA framework. With that, I'll turn it over to Vardhini and Michael to begin the presentation.
Thanks. And I did see that there's a note about a potential significant echo, so we'll try and minimize that as much as we can on this. So, as noted, my name is Michael Mooney. I have Vardini with me as well. And so, just kind of an overview of the presentation for everyone's benefit is the purpose of this one is kind of an introductory high level with respect to this. We are going to be stopping periodically to take questions through the presentation as well as have a Q&A period at the end. We are going to try to answer all the questions you have, but we will be taking any questions that are unanswered and we will follow up with answers to those where appropriate. And if there is interest, we're happy to put on a follow-up presentation that does a bit of a deeper dive into this topic as well. But this really is kind of an introductory presentation into the new CLI-ECA framework. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to turn things over to Vardini. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rishabh. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Today's session, we will walk through the new CLI-ECA Consolidated Linear Infrastructure Environmental Compliance approval process, but we will see what it means for municipalities, what kind of key risks and responsibilities it introduces, and how municipalities can prepare to implement it effectively. So uh, today's session is not a language, deep dive into a policy language or a regulatory language. What we are going to do differently is like how it affects the municipalities and what they need to do differently. Right. So today's agenda, what we will mainly look through is that what has actually changed, what are the municipalities most exposed from a compliance perspective, and what are the practical strategies on how you can implement and prepare yourself. So that is the intent and plan for today's session. Let's get started, and we will stop at selected points where we can take in questions. So that way it is easy. And also we have question and session. Like mentioned, we can also take more questions in the end. So what historically Ontario has been ECA approvals has been project based. So every time you actually have like a pumping station upgrade or a new sewer installation or a force main upgrades, you actually do your environmental compliance approval for each project. But what is this new CLI-ECA bringing into the framework is that you actually have a system-wide single MECP approval. Here, there is one approval which covers your entire linear system, right? It covers your collection system, sanitary collection system, as well as your stormwater systems. So sanitary sewers, hose mains, pumping stations, storm sewers, ditches, culverts, ponds. Here, it also brings into the focus that stormwater is also as equally scrutinized as a sanitary system. What this means, what consolidation means is that we are not completely getting rid of all the individual ECAs, but here the system operation, the compliance here is tied to system operation and uh, accountability for ongoing system performance, right? Fundamentally, the idea for this new CLI-ECA is to streamline and modernize the approval process and having a better risk-based assessment or implementation of the projects or capital infrastructure planning. So the purpose is this, but what does it translate into? What does it mean? It means the responsibility is shifting upstream, right? So the MECP is actually putting a little more onus and ownership onto the municipalities to do the compliance as a proactive approach. So there is a shift in the responsibility.
Vardini, maybe before we move on, for everybody's benefit, kind of that shift, we're going to talk a little bit more details about the benefits that that shift is going to provide, but maybe touch a little bit more on kind of the shift from like construction-driven compliance and permitting to kind of what the system-wide actually means and kind of the timing of when that would start having to enter into the equation versus kind of being triggered by a specific project.
Yeah. So that these aspects of when what it triggers, we will look at it more detailed as we go forward with probably with examples and all. So like earlier, we used to have an ECA for each project, right? So if you have a pipe or pipe upgrade or a pumping station upgrade or a sewer extension, you would actually have its own approval. So, but right now, your whole linear system is brought under a consolidated single approval framework. But what it means is that you need to have a better understanding of your system, have your documents in place, and have a standard procedures in place to accommodate that, right? It's not just okay. So, for example, if you build a sewer, your compliance approval is for that when you design it, does the system has the capacity? But your CLI-ECA changes the shift into does your system has capacity today? However, it was designed 20 years or 30 years back, you have the responsibility to understand your system capacity, whether does the system has the capacity today, not when it was designed, right? So that is what the CLA's the new shift is basically that it's actually current compliance level, not what it was when you designed it and when it was approved, right? So that is the one shift you actually, and that actually changes the risk management. So for example, from a province's perspective, what the province's perspective, what the CCLA has changed is the risk. Every risk was assessed project by project, right? Right now, in the CLI-ECA, the language is such that the risk is assessed at an organizational and operational level. So that way it is distributed and it increases, it puts the responsibility of regulatory and oversight onto the municipality, right? And here, another thing that we have to look for is the stormwater is now scrutinized as almost as closely as wastewater. And here, the reliance would more be on the documents and procedures and self-monitoring and self-reporting. Instead of enforcement, like Mike said before, earlier we used to have one project, we come up with the design, we do an ECA approval, and that's where, there was an enforcement process involved from a province's perspective. Here, it's more of a audit-driven style. So that's where the shift is happening. And overall, the idea is that you actually have a standardized common framework across the Ontario. But what this will enable is actually to make data-driven insights. It gives you insight on better planning and an implementation of your projects. Going on to the next one from what this means for municipalities, right? What has it changed for municipalities is that the engineering roles are expanding. It is no longer just designing infrastructure and implementing them. It is also about the engineering responsibility of understanding your system performance, documenting them, and also having a change management system in place. Like say, if there is a sewer that is being updated, upsized, you need to actually have a system wherein you document it and you come back and update your system inventory. You need to kind of have that kind of a backfeeding system back into your data and actually have it record. So there is that kind of a responsibility being put on engineering. So it's municipalities now needs to demonstrate their understanding of the system boundaries. They also need to know their system asset inventories, and also the operational performances, right? So this does not mean less responsibility, but more of ownership from municipalities' perspective. So that's what this new CLI-ECA is bringing into the place. So why it matters? So we saw that the shifting responsibilities from MECP, it is going into the municipalities. Municipalities have more ownership. And it is also about streamlining the approvals and all the regulatory risk management and efficiency. Yes. But why it matters? So what it requires from a municipality's perspective is that it requires you to have a better understanding of your infrastructure systems. It means keeping your models updated or having the asset data and the system information current, right? It expects that kind of proactive approach on maintaining the data to be current and having that knowledge and understanding. And also, it is critical in making your capacity decisions or any decisions, your projects or any triggers for any projects, capital projects coming along. This is a place where it will help you with justifying them, right? But overall, it introduces new responsibilities, but also it creates an opportunity for municipalities to strengthen by understanding, managing their system and planning. It'll give you a better planning tool for you to managing your infrastructure systems. So that is what we see this opportunity as.
Yeah, and I think one of the benefits that we're going to get into later with kind of what's at stake around the risk side of this is with the right documentation and the right supports in place, it gives the municipalities an opportunity to kind of also use specialized risk management tools in kind of managing their systems and their upgrades and taking a more holistic look at your system wide when you're talking about approvals versus drilling down on very specific things. So why it does bring some requirements for having a better, deeper understanding of your infrastructure for compliance purposes, it does start to introduce some flexibility that can be utilized in terms of the approval processes to better allow municipalities to manage their infrastructure as well. And so I think there's a bit of a double edge here to this new process that we need to be aware of as we kind of implement and we see this moving forward.
So where does the CLI-ECA apply, right? So the CLI-ECA applies to municipally owned sanitary and stormwater systems. It applies to the assets owned by the municipality. It is in the if it is in the municipal right of way or easement, and it also applies to low risk alteration to existing infrastructure, right? So basically, storm waters, storm sewers, ditches, ponds, after the assumption from the development, as force mains, pumping stations, and all of it. But another thing that we need, so it does not apply to the private owned system or developer works or any new discharges to water bodies, right? If you have an outfall, if you are making a new outfall, it doesn't cover. This one doesn't cover that. You still need a separate ECA for that. Or if you're doing a high risk non-standard, say for example, large diameter, or if you have a sensitive place where you are building a storm pond. So those kind of things, or we will still need ECA depending on its implication, or if it is a high capacity system, you still need a separate ECA for that. But another thing to look for here is there is a set of pre-authorized works that is coming along. So if you can have a pre-authorized works will be covered under this ECA, say new sewers or replacement of your sewers, force main and manhole upgrades, and pond modifications, right? If it is within certain limit, or existing outfall repairs, all of this can fall under existing ECA, provided, however, you still need to have the documentation of standard procedures. Like you need to have a process in place for that to happen. If you can show that, if you can show that you actually have an existing standard procedures, you actually have documented the process to follow, and you actually have a system to maintain the documentation and do the change management in place, then all of these things actually can fall under the ECA. You wouldn't need a separate ECA to go ahead and build a new sewer within the municipal boundary, right? So these are the benefits. But come to think of it, where could we have you know, compliance gaps, right? What are the cracks through which we would fall? So some things that we can see is the aging in stormwater infrastructure, or legacy ponds without any design records, or you have an outfall, or say, for example, you know there is an outfall, but you don't know the record. You don't know the details of it. You don't know at what is the discharge elevation, overflow elevation for it. It is you what all you have is like a 1980 report with some information, right? These are the gaps through which you could create your own compliance failures, right? So that is where the ownership and the proactiveness comes into play.
So Vardini, let's pause there actually, because we do have one question that came in, but let's give an opportunity for any questions kind of around this of where the CLI-ECA stuff applies. So one of the first questions is would changes to combined sewers or separating them from storm and sanitary still be an MECP ECA approval process?
Okay, separating the combined and this one.
Yeah, so
Combined.
I think it's twofold. It's changes to combined sewers, right? So
Yeah.
separating them, like so separating them out, would that still be an MECP ECA approval, or would that fall under pre-authorized works? Is what I gather the question is getting at.
So see, it could fall under consolidated. It all depends on what kind of CLI-ECA you structure. So this is another thing. Every municipality comes with its own way of what is covered under CLI-ECA. So the CLI-ECA is still evolving. So you can add it in, provided you establish clear roles, clear procedures. It will still need you to follow most of the work that you will do, whether it is an individual ECA or a separate ECA. But it can be under CLI ECA, provided you actually have a documented SOP approved with your director, CAO, all of that is there under it, then it will be coming in, right? So, but again, the point is that you need your CLI-ECA for your municipality need to have that in your umbrella. You have to define it in your Schedule C. Like there are different schedules that it comes along once you start developing your document, and you can add those in there. And if there is a clear documentation which is approved, and you see that it is compliance approval ready, then you can bring in. But again, it's still, but in that approval, in that document, it will still include all the work that you need to do for an individual ECA. But if you
And I think and I mean, there's a lot of detailed, like very specific questions coming in, and I think we're happy to dive into those questions. And I know that some have probably received guidance and have had conversations with the ministry on this. The key thing really is it's about what the CLI ECA process is in a sense, in terms of like a global permitting requirement that's being in place that basically shifts the responsibility. So some of these situations that are being raised would actually be hybrids. They may fall under the CLI ECA, but they may still require specialized approvals. And what it's actually going to come down to is how you're managing and documenting your systems. So when we talk about what large diameter and high capacity systems mean, the risk associated with that is relative to the municipality that's talking about what their function is and what they have in place for their CLIs. And so this is where the risk management piece of the requirements comes in around the CLI and ECA and the documentation and the standard operating procedures and the processes that you as the municipality would establish. that would kind of dictate some of the confines of pre-authorized work. The key thing is that the ministry is still reserving the right, even with the CLI-ECA, to basically regulate and to permit and get involved in the processes. So the direct answer is going to be is that for most municipalities, it's going to come down to the specifics of your municipality and what you have in place as to whether or not something would fall under pre-authorized works and or whether or not MECP would require additional ECA application processes related to the project or the construction itself. So it's not as a black and white, you will apply for this, you won't apply for this, as you once may have been used to. And that's going to be a bit of the learning curve and where some of the gaps are going to exist, not just at the municipality, but also at the ministry level as this is being rolled out and implemented. And we're having conversations with them that are still, in a lot of cases, particularly around the sanitary side of things, there are still questions about what exactly are going to be the limits and requirements that the ministry is going to impose. And so I think we'll dive in a little bit more to some of those questions. They're all very, very good questions. But Vardini, if you wanted to continue, I'll make note of the questions that were specific and we can kind of loop back to them at the end of the session here because we'll have more time to chat about that.
So coming down to the requirements under CLI-ECA, right? So under the CLI-ECA, the municipalities are expected to meet key sum operational and documentation requirements here. So there is system inventory. Say, for example, your GIS data needs to have your ownership, pipe size, assumption, status, or all of those information to have a updated inventory or have a process where you keep updating your inventory in place. And then comes to a design criteria, right? Having a clarity on hydraulic and servicing standards must be clearly stated, but also have a process for reviewing those standards are being met, right? Those are the two things that they would expect, that's an expectation under this, or having a future alteration. So for example, you actually have a subdivision that is getting approved and it is discharging into a location, but do you have a process in place to check the downstream capacity? Is that part of your process? So these are the kind of things that they would expect that would fall, and that are the requirements that would fall under the CLI-ECA. Also, the pump station performances. I know most of the municipalities do check the pumps performance, alerts, bypass events, all of it. But are you documenting them, or are you monitoring the thresholds of so those kind of documentation, and what is the exceedances limit, how often is the exceedances, and is it being recorded? Is it being flagged? So those are the kind of things that would come under this now. So, and overflow risk, or how you manage your risk. Do you have a process in place to manage the risk of a sanitary sewer overflow? Or are you actually having in place monitoring programs to maintain your storm facilities, outfalls, and all of that, right? So these are some of the requirements that would fall under CLI-ECA. Most of them are being done already. It would be more into having a proper documentation and operational, and having a backfeeding between the, if there is one thing you're doing and you have to go back, does it go back to the next pillar of the work, and does it get updated? So those kind of things is what it falls under. So coming to what the municipalities need to do differently, right? The biggest change is not technical, right? We are not going to do something that we haven't been doing. Municipality still is going to do what they are doing. But here, from a project by project review, your actually system-wide thinking is being implemented, right? From an engineering level, you need to move into system level thinking, maintaining it. So it's not just build a model, forget about it for next 3 years, and then come back to it in just before you need to update in 5 years. That's not the thing. You need to kind of have a maintaining, updating and maintaining your models, and also having to demonstrate your capacity. So, for example, if you're doing a sewer upgrade, you see a sewer is flooded, you're upsizing it, but you also need to kind of show the capacity of the system overall. Under it's not just one sewer section, right? So, and also a stronger performance tracking, right? You need to have your inspection records or bypass events recording, all of that. A strong, the formal assessment of your assessment asset management programs. So these are the kind of expectations from an operations and asset management perspective. But from a governance perspective, you need to have a clearer standard procedure, operating procedures, or having internal controls on how these things are implemented or how these things are communicating between each other, right? Engineering is there, planning, engineering, operations, management. How are they communicating with each other? Having an internal control system and having a standard procedure. So this is an expectation that is there from a governance perspective. But all of this, what does it change from a workflow perspective, right? For engineers or for operator, say, for example, for an asset management team, what exactly does it change, right? Say, for example, in engineering workflow, if there's a new subdivision coming along and you need to approve it, you need to have a hydraulic modeling or a downstream trunk sewer capacity assessment has to be done when you are having a post-construction update. So having a system in place where once the construction is done, you need to have a system inventory update process in place for that from an engineering perspective. Or from an operations perspective, do we have an monitoring program? Like having a, those kind of having a, if you have basement floodings, how do you record it? Do you actually have any infiltration program in place? Do you have flow monitoring programs? Those kind of things. And it's not just, and also when it comes to all of this, the procurement, how do and also you have to think about when you give out your request for work, you need to think about how the consultant scopes changes, right? You have to have when you write your proposals, like you need to actually have the consultant scope should include documentation, right? Which will satisfy the CLI-ECA requirement. That is also something that will need to be kept in mind. So how would these changes or these requirements be applied in practice, right? So all these requirements may sound broad, regulatory, but how do you think all of this would get implemented? The first and foremost thing from all of this write-up is the documentation and having a standards in place, right? So it would require you to have a live document. It's not like you make a report of a CLI-ECA report, you make it and then you forget it, you come back 5 years. No, it's a constant update. It's a live static reports, right? And having a required monitoring regimes, right? Having flow monitoring programs in there, or having a clear SCADA data, or if there is a SCADA data loss, identifying them and working on them, right? And above everything, having an internal governance and internal reporting structure, say having a defined compliance role, having somebody who would lead this, or having an internal accountability for interdepartment communication, right? So these are the kind of aspects in reality when it comes to implementing all these requirements come into play. And also the municipality size plays a huge role in how this gets rolled out, right? For a larger municipality, you have a complex interconnected system, right? And then you would need you have large data, you have huge infrastructure. You would need a dedicated team and all compliance team, dedicated compliance, dedicated data team, and all of that. But when it comes to smaller municipalities, you have fewer assets, but I wouldn't say simpler system, but more fragmented documentation, fragmented systems in place, right? So you might need to do it in a very consultant support or you actually only focus on the critical assets and actually you come up with the risk areas, or it all rolls out. The CLI-ECA would roll out very differently for a large municipality and a small or a medium municipality or a rural municipality.
Yeah.
That's the very important aspect in all of this.
Yeah. One of the easy, and kind of getting to
Mike, I
a
think you're
number of
muted.
the questions that are coming up. One of the big things is one of the things is the shift in mindset. So,
Sorry, is Mike talking?
yeah, can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me, Verdini?
I can hear you, Michael.
Okay.
Sorry, something is wrong. I think Mike is.
Yeah, so I'll let Verdini continue. It looks like my mic might be acting up a little bit, so we'll get Verdini to continue. So
Sorry, there is a technical difficulty here. Bear with us. Okay, I'll move on to the next one. So we have seen the requirements. We have seen what kind of changes it is expecting on the municipalities, expectation or the responsibility shift within the municipalities. And we can look at how this would get implemented, right, within the municipalities. How do you think this requirements is going to get implemented? But there is a four aspects on which the implementation framework would fall under, right? So there is governance, policy, and having the asset data and documentation aspect, then the monitoring and reporting and operational process where ensuring day-to-day activities is tracking, monitoring, and fundamentally it's backfeeding into the documentation and backfeeding into the reporting, which again goes under the umbrella. So this is like a cyclic approach where all these four pillars, one feeds into the other, it backfeeds and it goes in there, right? So these are the four pillars on which the fundamental implementation pathway is going to work. So as you start implementing this, right, the common pitfalls, there is still a gray area. There is still a lot of back and forth. We are still figuring out, the MECP is figuring out on how it would get implemented, what would come in, what would be non-standard and all, right? But having said that, from a municipality perspective, what are the common pitfalls that you could, like we could have the challenges, pitfalls or challenges, right? So first one is the fragmented documentation. You have there is an outfall, or there is a huge culvert exists, or there is an outfall that is existing, but you don't know its elevation, or you don't know the overflow trigger, or there is no original design drawings. All you have is like a report, right? So like earlier example I have been telling about, or is the having a monitoring and reporting place. You actually have, say for example, you actually have an overflow there, but you don't have a system in place to track the frequency and the volume of the overflow, right? So that is another thing where you don't actually have the system, or you don't actually have an integrated SCADA system in place, or the data loss in the SCADA system, or being unaware of those data losses. So those are the kind of things that some of the municipalities might face when this gets, when you go about implementing those things. And then there is the gap in the infrastructure, right? Like you have a legacy storm pond but not clear on the ownership or all of that. But another less obvious challenge, right? All of these are physically visible, tangible challenges. But another thing that we all see, when it comes to any compliance is the version control on process changes or anything, right? Having a document, having a live document, like having a documentation in the first round, yes, but having it controlled, having it updated at the right time, having it the new version available. So that is another thing that also kind of something that municipalities might find it challenging. These are some of the challenges that can come across once you at the start of it, right? But these are the starting point, right? And this will help with the risk management under this new system. Mike, do we take any questions? Is your
Yes, can you hear
speaker
me? It
working?
looks like everybody else can hear me.
You are still not able to. We can't hear you.
All right. So I'm just going to chat for a bit. It just looks like Verdini may not be able to hear what I am saying. So I just sent a message. But if you have any questions, feel free to kind of enter them in before we kind of get into kind of a case scenario walkthrough. But what I do want to kind of flag, because a lot of the questions are kind of around this idea of what does apply and what doesn't apply, is the ESLA, this process isn't really necessarily replacing all of the current processes that you have in place across the board. As we mentioned, the ministry is still reserving the right in a lot of cases to enforce kind of the usual approvals and processes. And so you can think of this more as like a blanket approval that a municipality can seek to allow them to proceed with works and expedite works that would have to be done to kind of maintain their systems. There are some exceptions to that, obviously, but the general piece is that the reason this doesn't apply to some things is because you still would have to go through the usual protocols and procedures for it, because you couldn't seek kind of a pre-approved self-management for it because you have yet to identify and kind of establish the operating. And so when that comes to unassumed works and private development works that are then going to be assumed in the agreements that are in place, it's not that they would never apply to a CLA process. It's just you still have to apply the usual mechanisms and procedures in place before until it can be assumed and you can move it over to potentially into kind of your CLI-ECA processes and programs. So I think one of the biggest confusions that's out there is this idea that it's going to cover everything. And the reality is this is kind of one more layer that the ministry is adding in to help try and expedite the processes and help expedite repairs and constructions and those things that the municipalities are trying to manage, but it's not necessarily replacing their ability to do project-based enforcement or applications. And like I said, we can do a little bit deeper dive into that at the end, but I did see a lot of questions coming through with kind of the same idea of like, why does this apply? Why does this not apply? And I think the simple answer to that is this is just kind of one more tool in a municipality. And this is why larger municipalities may have an easier time taking advantage of these approvals than smaller municipalities might. And also managing of kind of the requirements that go around kind of for this, because really it's the idea of taking on the role and being audited by the ministry to ensure compliance to everything that has been set up versus deferring to them for every decision, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but just trying to paint kind of the contrast between the two thought schools around what this is. Vardini, if you can hear me, proceed. Yeah. Feel free to proceed. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to kind of take an example and to illustrate how these pieces come together, right? So I'm still taking an example of a combined sewer, right? If you actually kind of document it up in under the CLI-ECA, and if you bring that under your CLI-ECAs, or say even if it is a sanitary sewer, right? You actually are doing a wet weather flow assessment, for example. If you do a wet weather flow assessment on your sewer and you observe that your flow exceedance is like under a 1 in 5 year storm, your flows exceed the capacity of the trunk sewer, or it triggers as a overflow event or a bypass event to an outfall or a river. This actually leads to an INI assessment, right? And this ILI assessment, and also it will lead to a pollution control and pollution prevention and control plan, right, to reduce the overflow frequency. So so a wet weather assessment can trigger these, right? And once you actually have that, and it would actually maybe going into a monitoring program designing, right? And then it also say for then you go ahead and say you want to do your stormwater facility, right? You go in there, you look for your pond, and you see that the flooding is happening because one of the upstream storm pond is not actually achieving its intended storage, or having the drawdown time is not achieved. So then you actually have your peak flows entering your combined system more because of that. So then it may be cause of a sediment buildup or outlet control issue, right? So you need then this triggers a design criteria update, right? It could trigger a design criteria update where the all the new developments would need updated stormwater detention criteria, or actually having the requirement to implement the low impact development measures, right? LID measures to reduce the peak flows. And overall, to support, then the municipality can do an annual review program where you do your update your hydraulic model, you review the overflow frequencies, and assess the system upgrades and operational changes. So in this example, so what started off as a wet weather issue in a system has connected into engineering studies, asset performances, design standard changes, and long-term monitoring, right? And all of this can all fall under one framework of CLI-ECA, right? Most of your engineering studies can be brought under this. Operational improvement studies, right? If you want to do a pumping station performance study or anything, if there is a if you identify there is a bypass event and you go in there, that study can fall under the CLI-ECA, right? So this is, and to help municipalities move from understanding all of this, right? You see all these examples that we have listed here, but we can come up with some practical tools and templates, like having a monitoring checklist, standard, some kind of an standard outlines, or a performance benchmarks that you need to kind of check off, or a governance models. So these are the kind of tools and templates that can be developed and be used to make the implementation of these requirements much more smoother, right? So as part of So to kind of as a starting point, right? So you actually have all these requirements in place, but as a starting point, we have developed a CLI-ECA readiness assessment tool. So this is to help municipalities evaluate the current level of preparedness, right? Though, so this link is available in the chat.
Yeah, so Verdini, we're going to drop that link into the chat.
Mm,
That'll make the self-assessment tool via a web portal available to everybody here as well. And then
mm.
definitely if people have various tools or interested in some of the tools that we might have, definitely happy to follow up and help provide some of those tools. I know there's a lot of questions coming through about like specific conversations that municipalities have had with MECP on stuff. And we can kind of provide a general response, but it's really difficult to provide a very detailed, specific response without having more parameters kind of around it. The big thing is that there's a fine line between kind of what they consider you can do for pre-approved and they don't want to see anything to do with it versus what they consider kind of high risk and other private pieces. So when we say private doesn't apply, that doesn't necessarily mean land development in a general sense. That generally we're talking about treatment trains and other systems that are being privately owned and operated for that. And they have their own set of requirements that they have to go through that would not fall under the CLI-ECA parameters. And so I think from the land development standpoint, happy to engage in some one-on-one conversations just around providing some more specific responses to that. But it's difficult without details to basically say anything more than it kind of depends on what exactly in terms of the private works, what exactly you're talking about in terms of private works, because there is a delineation made between kind of general land development and kind of your drainage and that versus like a private owned treatment facility and train that's being put in place and is going to be operated and run by a condo corporation or a developer before it gets assumed or integrated into the municipal system. So it does become a little bit of a case by case response. And so I apologize that I can't provide a more detailed response for those things, but definitely the form does, if you hit the submit button on the end of the form that we're doing, it does send me a note. And so if you have specific questions or tools that you're looking for with respect to the ECA, type that into the bottom of the form and hit send, and we will follow up with kind of more specific responses to your questions. I am also going to take a copy of all the questions that are asked here today, and we'll do our best to follow up with some more specifics to the individuals with those questions, just so that we can kind of stay at the intended focus of this, which is kind of introductory. And those that kind of want to do a deeper dive into it, again, we can also look at putting on another session that's specifically for kind of diving deeper into the things, because there is going to be some hair splitting here. Like, that is the unfortunate part of the way the CLI-ECA program has been kind of developed and is being rolled out, is there is some hair splitting that has to be done, and that largely is coming down to a risk management approach in terms of how sophisticated the municipality is at kind of managing their design standards and their risks and other elements with that as well. So happy to answer. Just wanted to apologize in advance if I don't get to the very details that individuals are asking for in their questions. So with that, we've posted the link, Vardini. You want to continue on talking just a little bit about some of the implementation options and stuff? And then what we'll do is we'll move into, and I'll start going through the list of the questions that we have with us, and we can start kind of looking at what we can answer in the time that we have left.
So earlier in the slide, I had touched upon the scale of the municipality, right? Like how the implementation and how the CLI-ECA get rolled out, the scale and the size of the municipality has a huge role in that. But irrespective of the size, there are three different ways this can get implemented into it, right? So you can have your own internal team where you actually have your compliance team, one portion which does the governance and policies. There is one which is all about operations and asset management. There is another one where there is engineering, design standard, monitoring, and all of that, right? So you have your in-house, you have your you have your internal data teams, you have all those things, and then you actually have a hybrid where you actually have a municipality with some of the work that is being done, but you bring in a consultant from an external expertise to kind of guide you through it with their tools and templates and all of that. And then there is a fully outsourced one. You bring in a consultant, so who does your technical analysis and compliance documentation. But regardless of this approach, the goal is the same, ensuring that the municipalities can demonstrate the system capacity or maintain accurate infrastructure records, right? And maintain the system capacity or monitor the performance and above all, maintain a compliance documentation, which can be, under the CLI-ECA, which could support the work, right? So the shift is kind of towards the system-based accountability for the municipal infrastructure instead of the individual components of the infrastructure, right?
I think the other thing worth noting is so one of the earlier slides we mentioned that one of the reasons this is being undertaken is kind of standardization. And I think it is important to note that standardization in approach doesn't necessarily mean it's a standardized solution across every municipality, because your system is going to greatly influence how the compliance and the approvals is going to work under the CLI framework. So I just wanted to clarify, like, what we're talking about is the ministry trying to take a standardization of approach versus necessarily specifically standardizing like a cookie cutter template for each each municipality there. So one of the questions we had, or statements that was made, was on one of the slides, we say that the CLI-ECA does not apply to unassumed works. The MECP has told us that once Part 4 of the forum is signed, it becomes part of the system, and we are responsible and must report on the annual report. And so this is where we start getting into the hair splitting. So it becomes a defining where the system is basically transitioning from the private ownership and private responsibility to basically the municipality. And in this case, yeah, assigning the part 4, you are basically acknowledging that you're integrating that facility into your municipals, and then that does become the responsibility of the municipality. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, how you get to that point is not always going to be a straight line or be exactly the same for each municipality or for every piece of unassumed works that's out there. And so again, there's a little bit of risk management that's involved in this and creating kind of your risk profiles as well as your design and compliance standards that you would use to kind of back up the position that you've taken in terms of your compliance under the CLI-ECA framework here. So hopefully that gives a little bit of an answer into that question, but it's not that it will never apply. It's about when the trigger actually occurs that makes it part of this approval regime versus other pieces. And so again, there's a question here about what is considered large diameter and high capacity systems. So Verdini, I don't know if you have any additional insight on that,
No,
but large,
that's where it is. Sorry.
yeah.
So it all depends. So the CLI-ECA gives a little bit of uh, control on what the municipality can define, which is the large diameter, which is the which diameter falls under pre-authorized, and which is the diameter, and that decision can be brought into under the CLI-ECA. But again, it all differs how Mike has told, right? Everything is very different between municipalities.
And so you have to spend some time defining like the one of the best approaches is kind of defining what those mean for your municipality. A larger municipality may quite often, as part of their regular scopes, be dealing with larger diameter, higher capacity systems than smaller municipalities. And so that's where the flexibility in defining that with the municipality comes in under this new process as well. So it's not meant to be so, like I said, it's not meant to be so black and white rigid. There are areas where there's not a lot of flexibility, but there are areas where basically the municipality can define where those cutoffs are. And then ultimately the ministry has to agree with it. But there's a starting point that allows a case to be made for the municipality through this kind of approach. The next question is would any sanitary sewer and water main, new or replacement, require pre-authorized ECA regardless of the pipe diameter, small diameter water main replacement as an example?
So water main is not covered under CLI-ECA. So for smaller diameter, again, the diameter, the location, the extent of the work, it is all, if it is a simpler upsizing, it can fall under CLI-ECA. However, it is all under how you structure your CLI-ECA, right? You need to have a documented standard procedure on, so there's basically everything, every decision making need to have a flow chart, right? If you have a decision making process in place, whether it falls under CLI-ECA or it goes under separate ECA, and document that decision making process under the CLI-ECA, then it works out, right? So it is, the effort is in actually defining that criteria or decision making process and documenting it under the CLI-ECA umbrella.
The next question is kind of similar in the sense of how is the MECP design criteria and the CLI-ECA intertwining? And I think the answer to that question is it comes down to how the municipalities are defining where their systems are under ESLAs on how those design criteria that are going to intertwine specifically with the individual CLI-ECA process. So again, there's a bit of a self-defining part of this with municipalities to work through. Now, the important thing here is that it's not just picking something random out of the air and saying that that's what it's got to be. It's got to be defensible, the position. It's got to be backed up with kind of
Yeah.
the thing, because the ministry can audit you on these things. And if they find you haven't kept up with the elements that are required to support kind of what's been defined, you can find yourself in conflict with the ministry over these things. So it's not so much saying you don't have to do all these things. It's kind of putting the onus to make sure you're doing them. And then the ministry would come in and kind of audit under the CLI-ECA versus kind of having a strict imposing kind of the limits up front, or the criteria up front on a project by project basis for that. The next question, I think, and I can't answer directly because it's directed towards the MEA. So I'll read it out, but maybe we'll make note of it for it. But does the MEA have any plans to indicate what works may be included exempt from the CLI-ECA process, i.e., new wastewater services lateral from a private development into the main, or a like-for-like replacement? And so I can't speak for MEA, and Vardini can't speak for MEA, but maybe we'll make note of that and we'll bounce that question over to the MEA team so that they can respond to that.
To add on to your previous point, Mike, on the design criteria, the CLI-ECA does do say that the MECP design criteria guidelines has to be, you know, absorbed, and that should be part. And having a design criteria under the CLI-ECA is actually a requirement,
Yeah.
right? And so you do need your design standards, and you do need to bring the MECP design guidelines into your design standards and file it on, bring it under the CLI-ECA
Yes.
umbrella. So there is a language there. So
Yeah, I think the key thing is that they basically saying it's up to the municipality to make sure they're integrating those standards where needed and as required into the design
yeah,
standards under the CLI ECA, right? And so
yeah.
again, they're putting the onus on the municipality for defining those things versus kind of taking a strict kind of regulatory standpoint on it, and switching again to that kind of audit-based system for it. So there is another question here: is we do not understand how unassumed development does not apply. We review and have authority for approval of those pipes as registered subdivision plans become town-owned and roads. And I think, again, this isn't so much defining what the municipality has authority over or what they do. It's about defining when the CLI-ECA process comes into effect versus whether or not we're talking about like a privately owned, privately run treatment system again. And so happy to get a little bit more specific on the private development side of things for that. The reality is we could have a whole webinar on just the private development
Mhm.
impacts
That,
of this all on its own, because
yeah.
it's complicated. It's not straightforward on that. So we can definitely look at providing more support on that. Um, the next question is how do municipalities take on risk from storm infrastructure when there are areas where local municipality is accepting stormwater by an upper tier municipality? And so I think really what they're getting at is what happens when you have the interaction between
between
systems
the between the
that have an
system.
upper tier and a lower tier municipality that's involved in the system.
So again, this is something that actually is not explicitly there. So this could, if you define it as a non-standard, it could fall under non-standard. But again, if you're upsizing a sewer or a quality of the stormwater, right, there are multiple aspects of it that can be looked at, and it is all in. So again, this is a case by case specific thing. It is about, you can fall that under a non-standard, but also on you need not blanketly put all of the storm under non-standard and having individual ECA. There will be components which could be, accommodated under CLA ECA for pre-authorized works or that way, or some of them could go as non-standard. So
Yeah.
it is again case to case. We need to understand what kind of, you know, interaction is happening between the municipalities.
Yeah. Now, so we are kind of at time. So Bardini and I are going to stay on. We're going to keep answering questions here, but feel free. I know everybody's given us an hour of their time today, so we will follow up with the questions and have more to come. But we are going to stay on and keep answering as many of the questions as we can here. In regards to that last one, I think the important piece is to again is when we look at the risk management of a system-wide thing that may have multiple owners and interactions, it doesn't the CLI-ECA doesn't take the responsibility away from you having to manage the various proponents of the system and what you may or may not define under kind of pre-approved or non-standard works or other elements of the CLI-ECA. Again, the requirement is still there. It's just rather than it being checked on a project by project basis up front, basically the ministry is kind of auditing that you are doing the appropriate work and those that need to be involved in terms of your reviews and your approvals and stuff like that are being reviewed. So in the case where you have upper tier and lower tier municipal interactions between infrastructure, it gets a little more complicated in how you define those works, but you can still define them. It's just the onus is on you as the municipality to make sure you're following through with those system stakeholders versus waiting for the ministry to tell you, like, have you done this, or forcing a lower tier or upper tier municipality to have to be involved or make changes through the permitting process. So again, it's a little bit of shifting perspective is it's not changing what you have to do per se. It's changing who's responsible and how it's managed and how the reviews and compliance is being handled more than anything. Again, it's putting the onus, taking it off of the ministry and putting it on to the municipalities. And it's, to be blunt, it's a little cherry picking that's happening with the ministry to try and get things moving. But it is an attempt to try and get the backlog dealt with and try to help things move forward and get to construction faster. So the next question is, would the CLI-ECA framework have an impact on triggering EAs with modifications to outfalls or other areas?
So modification to outfall can fall under pre-authorized works if you actually if you define it that way, right? Earlier we have talked about, but would it trigger an EA? Yeah, the criteria for what is going to trigger an EA still applies, right? That is not changing, right? If you're doing a modification work and you find that there is a change in the amount of flow that is happening, or change in the structure that you need to do, or it's not just a small modification, but it is going to be a new structure, or it's going to be an expansion, right? Or it's gonna warrant more than a simple modification, then yes, that will, if the EA, the selection, if it would trigger EA under normal condition, it will still trigger an EA under this condition.
Yeah, I think one of the easiest ways to look at it is to think of it as like a repair where you're doing something to it that basically has no change to, in the case of sanitary, there's no change to your effluent and there's no real change to your mixing zones or other modeling that you're required to do as kind of part of those discharges. That becomes a very simple, straightforward, pre-approved piece of repair work that you can do. If you are making changes where you are going to change the effluent or you may significantly impact the mixing zones in other areas with respect to your discharge, the EA requirements and stuff still get triggered and you may have to follow through. But again, it's still on the municipality to ensure that they've completed the correct assessments to determine whether it does fall under the pre-approved works or if
Or
it would
the
trigger other requirements that have to be done, right? And so it doesn't really save on the work. It's just expediting the timelines with respect to the ministry having to issue approvals or do reviews and those other pieces. So simple modifications or repair work generally would fall under pre-approved works. But if you're changing that effluent or you're changing mixing zones, as an example, that likely is not going to fall under pre-approved work unless you have a framework that's been accepted under the CLI ECA processes for kind of minor modifications in that regard. Does the CLI ECA apply to ditches? So are you referring to municipal roadside ditches or to ditches that are part of larger storm water management systems? So does the CLI-ECA apply to just kind of your basic roadside ditch, or is it specifically to basically stormwater management systems, ditching for stormwater management systems?
My understanding it is stormwater management systems, right? So that is what actually is being talked about. So it is, if it is part of a larger stormwater management system, you have ditches, then that falls under this.
Okay. Um, in the context of stormwater management systems and the CLI-ECA, is there a difference between outlets and outfalls? And so I think really what they're getting at is on the stormwater management side of things, we talk about outlets, and on the sanitary side of things, we talk about outfalls.
Outfalls.
And kind of does CLI-ECA consider those to be interchangeable, I think is what the question is getting at.
It see if so it is not interchangeable, right? Stormwater is stormwater, but stormwater is also under CLI-ECA, right? So both of them will fall under CLI-ECA, but they are not interchangeable in the language or the context or the placement.
Yeah. So this goes back to similar what we were saying before is you can make the change as long as it's not impacting what's coming out of the pipe or kind of your downstream impacts, but you're still responsible for doing the assessments to make sure that that is the case as
Yeah.
part of your pre-approved works. And then I got a bunch of stuff, people saying my microphone is fine. So I appreciate that, everybody. Thanks for letting me know. For municipalities that do not currently have a CLI-ECA, are project-specific ECAs still being accepted?
Mm,
So that one actually is going to depend on who you talk to at the ministry on it. So that's actually a really hard one to answer because some are, yes, they're still doing it, but as we've heard, some municipalities have been told, like, do not submit ECA applications if they relate to pieces. And so happy to get into the details of exactly kind of what we're thinking around that question and provide some more specific information on that, because unfortunately that is not a black and white answer right now in the process. So, and we have talked a little bit about the ministry saying do not submit any more ECA applications relating to subdivisions or anything under the pre-approved. So we'll follow up with that one. Now, we did talk a little bit also about the CLI-ECA does not apply to private-owned systems. Would you be able to explain further on when the privately owned systems become part of the treatment train and achieve stormwater management criteria, or the ECLA would apply to these? And so we've talked a little bit about that, but if the individuals that wrote that question would like some more information, feel free to fill out the form and just send me a note, and I'm happy to provide some more specific. And then where the municipal CLI-ECA identifies that performance criteria from a Class EA is applicable to a project, but the Class EA criteria is less stringent than the current municipal criteria, example being in a design criteria document, which performance criteria must be followed? So
uh,
yes.
yes.
So basically, the more stringent of the two
One
are what
is
is going to apply in terms of
so
your CLI compliance pieces.
exactly
So
that it's the stringent one will go with that.
yeah, and so this is where making sure, even in terms of like your broader system and some of the other works that you're doing, is establishing those like standardized design criteria and standards so that you have uniformity across the documents and you don't run into these situations where you may have more stringent pieces. But at the end of the day, the more stringent criteria is going to apply. It's going to default to that,
Yes.
similarly to how in the past, the more stringent criteria has generally been what's accepted for that. So, so just to clarify, developers are prescribed persons under a CLI-ECA, and any development undertaken under the CLI-ECA, the developer has to follow all conditions under the CLI-ECA from submission until assumption Schedule E conditions 1 and 2. So they're just looking for clarify that, like, from the development context, if a developer is undertaking work under the CLI-ECA, that they are responsible for ensuring that those requirements are met and those conditions
Yes.
are met and followed. And the answer to that,
Yes.
yes. The replacement of an existing sewer with a new sewer that has a similar dimensions and performance criteria and that is in the same or approximately the same location if the existing sewer was used, operated, established, altered, or extended in accordance with an approval granted by Director OREG 4015-3-1. This is the most recent update to the reg and could be open for interpretation. Does this mean that the majority of the work we undertake under infrastructure design and construction projects do not require the CLI-ECA?
Mm. It's
So I'm going to say that that is a question we can definitely answer offline because we're diving into policy and what supersedes other policy in terms of the regs. And I'll just generally, for everybody's benefit that's still here, I will say is that there are these conflicts like still everywhere. And they are getting resolved, but it's a bit of an order of precedence and like the authority that's on it. And yes, you could make arguments, but it comes down to what is going to be kind of, I don't want to say the path of least resistance, but from the purpose of the CLI-ECA program, it really is designed about helping expedite processes and getting repairs and stuff done. So I would say generally, yes, you could make an argument for that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you will be free and clear of the CLI-ECA because the ministry is still defining how to deal with some of those discrepancies between kind of policy documents and regulations. So that would be something that might be worth being creating. That might be worth something where MEA might look at how to advise municipalities around those types of situations because we haven't specifically looked at that. So um, just a thank you. What is your understanding of how the transition period applies on Schedule D, Item 9? So again, I think we'll take that question away because it's a very specific question, and we will share all the responses that we provide back to everybody. But let us take that one away and kind of respond back to that one because we are kind of getting to the end of time here. There is, I believe, you can establish new outfalls on your own land or on land where you have the owner's permission. And again, the outfall comes down to like what falls under the outfall really is how you've defined it, as well as what the impacts are of what's coming out of your outfall or your outlet. So it's not a black and white kind of answer. It's dependent on what exactly you're trying to do. Um, most most municipalities adopting the linear infrastructure in development specifically at the time of underground acceptance or at the time of assumption. Happy to provide a response to that in writing following up based on what experience with our clients. But that is an experience with our clients. And so that might be a broader question to take advantage of the MEA form to kind of see what others are doing, but happy to provide the perspective of our clients on that. And then the last two questions is the ministry still requiring municipal drains created through the Drainage Act within urban areas to be included within the CLI-ECAs? I recall the response was yes at the early stages of the CLI rollouts, but I believe that there was a lot of pushback from some municipalities on that. So basically through the Drainage Act and the urban drains, the municipal drains that are being created, is that still included in the CLI-ECA process, or has that been removed due to the pushback from municipalities? That one I'm not entirely sure about, so I would have to look into
Review
it.
that.
I think it still does apply, but I'm not sure. So how about we loop back for Dini on that one as well?
Yeah, I have to see if they have removed it. I thought initially it was part of it, but I
Yeah.
don't know if they have removed it or not. We need to
Okay.
review that on a detailed
Okay,
basis.
so we'll follow up with that one as well. And then the last question is, how do you differentiate between linear infrastructure and consolidated linear infrastructure?
consolidated, like, so the linear infrastructure and see the it
So
so to
they're the
they're the
same
same.
thing,
They're the
right?
same
Like
thing.
the consolidated part really is trying to bring your whole system under an
Mm,
approval framework versus having individual components of linear infrastructure done on an approval. So at the end of the day, your linear infrastructure is your linear infrastructure. The intent is taking a system-wide approach to your linear infrastructure, i.e., consolidating an
yeah.
approval process
Yes.
versus trying to define different types of linear. Water main, though, is separate. Like, so water main is separate from this, I
Mm,
think, is one of the key takeaways on it. So,
yes.
so that's kind of that. So that was the last question. So I really appreciate everybody's time on this. I'll keep an eye out for any emails from any of the participants on questions that they might still have, or if they're wanting like a more nuanced response in terms of their questions, and we'll
I
follow up
think
with
there is
that.
two hands raised.
Is there two hands raised? I don't
Yeah.
see. Is it?
Yes, there are two hands raised. If you have time, I can allow
Yes.
them to speak and
Let's.
they
Yes,
can.
absolutely.
We have Mohammed Siddiq. If you
Hi,
can
Mohammed.
turn on your hi Mohammed, if you can turn on your mic and ask your question, please.
Thank you.
We do have another hand raised from Adam. I can
Yep,
allow him to talk in the meanwhile.
absolutely. Hi, Adam. If you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, sorry. I guess I just hit that by accident.
Okay.
My
Oh,
apologies.
sorry.
No worries, no worries at all. Like I said, we do want to make sure we get everybody's questions answered. So
Yeah.
we will be providing, again, you will get a copy of the presentation. You can reach out to us. This is going to be shared on the MEA website as well, and we will follow up with responses to questions we weren't able to answer more detailed on this session. But please feel free to reach out and take advantage of the assessment tool to flag anything that we may have missed on the assessment tool too that you would like to talk about. This is definitely an evolving piece across the province, and we're definitely keeping a close eye on it. And our clients are, just like you all, our clients are quite interested and concerned with how this is being rolled out and implemented. So.
Thank you.